let's talk about race and ethnicity, because that's the theme of this channel. And yes, I openly acknowledge in the first 10 seconds, I acknowledge that race is a complete social construct. I get it. But the fact that people watch these videos tells me that there's still more that we need to sort out about all this. We need to be able to talk about it openly so we can understand ourselves and each other better. So let's check out a comment that I just received this morning on a video I made a couple months ago called, "In the USA, Mexicans are seen as a hybrid race, Native American and mainly Spanish." To which Milo Munez left this comment, quote, "Put me in a box, baby. Most of the Mexicans are almost half white and so much more." No, he goes on, but ultimately I want to acknowledge that. And because that's one of the things I constantly remind people of on this channel. Because I have a lot of viewers in Europe and they're, I think, triggered, confused, annoyed by the fact that the United States has a different perspective of Mexicans. In the United States, we don't care about your nationality, where you're actually born and raised and from. We're looking at ethnic background. So if your ethnic background is Mexican, whether you were born there or not, you're perceived as Mexican. That's how it works. So my grandma, who was born here in the United States, she was Mexican. She did speak Spanish. Her accent, if anything, was from Buffalo, New York. But she was ultimately still perceived as Mexican by default from that. And her name was Spanish, so there was that too. But ultimately, culturally beyond that, she really wasn't that big into Mexican culture, if you ask me. It wasn't obvious. Except when you looked at her, you could tell there was, and see, that's how it is. That's how it is in the United States as we perceive who is Mexican or not. What makes it more frustrating for people in Europe is we recognize here in the United States that if you're a Mexican American, you're going to have a certain predictable look because around half of your DNA is going to go back to Native American, Mayan, Aztec, etc. And the other half is largely predictably going to be Spanish, European, etc. Specifically Spanish. It could be half and half. You could be like my grandmother, who according to the DNA test, apparently she was more like 80% Native American. But either way, you're going to kind of have that mix there. And there's a predictable look that most Mexican Americans have, or Mexicans have. When we think of a Mexican person, there's a certain look. Think of Pedro from Napoleon Dynamite, perfect example. On a similar note though, Black Americans are in a similar situation there. I've made many videos about this and many Black Americans have confirmed my theory on this, or my prediction, and that is that if you're a Black American, you're something like 2/3, 3/4 African DNA, and the rest is predictably going to be European. So if you're a Black American, you're already a mixed race. But what's weird is in the United States, if somebody has a Black parent, meaning that they're 2/3 Black and or 2/3 African to 3/4 African and the rest white, but that constitutes as what we perceive as a Black person. Then on the other side, they have a parent who is 100% European descent. Well, if they have a child, when they have a child, that child is biracial or mixed, which is funny to me because already the Black parent is already mixed themselves. It's not until that we tip the scales where there's more European DNA that they become mixed. But as far as if there's more African DNA, they're not considered mixed. Most Black Americans are just called Black Americans. They're not called mixed, not until they have a child with someone who is basically 100% European. See, that's interesting. That's how it works here. That's how the perception is. I'm not saying I agree with it either way, but what I am saying is, for Mexican Americans and Black Americans, we're talking about groups of people who are by default biracial. But it's not really perceived that way, even though it actually is that way, even though DNA tests confirm that. If you're a Mexican American or if you're a Black American, chances are what I just said about your ethnic background is true. It's pretty easy to predict. However, that doesn't seem to matter, does it? It's more about how you identify. And as Americans, on a nearly daily basis, we have to identify our race and ethnicity. From the age of a child, we're filling out that form. Are you white? Are you black? Are you Hispanic but not white? You have to put yourself into a box. And then at the bottom, there's one that's mixed. But ultimately, a lot of us are already mixed to begin with. And that was why it was always confusing for me, knowing that I had a Mexican grandmother, and it says white, not Hispanic. Well, I'd be lying if I said not Hispanic. I am. I'm not saying that I'm mainly, but a quarter of my heritage goes back. So I think that's interesting. I think we need to have open, honest conversations about this. Yes, race is a social construct. But as long as there's racial tension, there's still things we haven't talked about like this, and just pointed out some obvious things like this. So I'm passing the mic to you. You continue the conversation from here in the comments.